Now let's move to today's perspective. And large swathes of Asia are sweltering through a heat wave that has topped temperature records all the way from Myanmar to the Philippines, forcing millions of children to stay home from school. The authorities in a series of countries from Cambodia, Myanmar, Vietnam, India, Bangladesh, for example, forecasting temperatures of above 40 degrees Celsius. We're just hearing, in fact, in the last hour or so, Bangladesh saying that it's been the hottest April there ever on record. Well, it all comes as here in Paris, a conference has been taking place at Sciences Po University. It's called Facing Environmental Crisis in South Asia. And one of those attending and speaking was Isha Ray. She's a professor at the Energy and Resources Group at the University of Berkeley. Thanks very much for coming in and talking to us today. Let's start off by talking about this current heat wave. As I just said, Bangladesh saying it's been the hottest April ever on record. It's a similar situation across a vast area of Asia, and it just seems to be getting worse and worse, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. I mean, when there's one heat wave, one can't directly attribute it to climate change, naturally. But I think there's no doubt that the trends are such that these heat waves are becoming more frequent, more intense, exacerbating water problems, exacerbating problems of suffering. Today, there are reports of 2 or 3 people who died in southern India entirely because of the heat wave. So it's a very tragic situation. It really is.
What does it actually mean for people who live in countries like this? I mean, some of us have experienced, I remember in Paris a few years ago, it was 44 degrees, but it just lasted for a day. You have to realise that this goes on sometimes for a week or even weeks.
Oh, yeah.
And how do people react and adapt to that?
So if you have resources and you have a home with, even if not an air conditioner, at least a fan, and you don't have water problems in your home because you have 24/7 water from your tap, which is something so many of us take for granted in the world, then you suffer, but you can stay inside. But working people who are low income in these very low resource settings usually have the kind of work which doesn't permit you to stay inside. So they're working on construction, or they're selling vegetables on the streets, or they have to be sort of out. And, they carry some water with them, but how long would a bottle of water last through intense heat of this type? 39, 41 degrees. It's just like beyond punishing, actually. There are hardly any words for it. And so it's terrible suffering. They have to work. It's terrible suffering. And I think city governments and certainly rural governments, don't do enough to just, it shouldn't be so difficult to set up some drinking water, stalls that people can help themselves to, or something, so simple measures like that, just to somewhat alleviate the extreme suffering and stress. And as we know, extreme heat brings on premature labor. That's another major danger for low-resourced women and their to-be-born children. It brings on stress from those who already have heart disease. So it's a terrible thing. It really is terrible.
I know you spend a lot of time, don't you, working on water provision. Yeah. I mean, obviously it depends where you are in the world, but how difficult is it to get water to everybody without having to resort to bottles? What can be done to make it easier and for people and communities?
Look, I'm going to just speak my own opinion right now, right? These countries are poor and they have a lot of unmet challenges. So I don't want to be cavalier when I say this. But it is not that we don't have the technology to deliver piped water to people, even in crowded and dense settlements. Many countries and cities have done it. Even low-resource countries and cities have actually made a lot of progress. So I think it's not, other than making up one's mind, the political will to spend that money and to put in that infrastructure, we're not talking about anything incredibly technologically challenging. In my view, I think states and donors who support the states are right now just not stepping up enough, even though I know they have a lot of competing interests.
And it's often women who are more affected than men as well, isn't it?
Yes, and that is for 3 reasons. One, if there isn't piped water on the premises, then someone has to go and fetch it. And this is almost always women, because water work is women's work. And sometimes girls, starting at the age of 11 or 12. So that's a drudgery. That's bad for one's physical health. That's bad for one's educational and work opportunities. So it's really quite a severe violation of human rights, really, in my view. The second reason it's difficult for women particularly is because when there is a small amount of water in the home that has been fetched and stored, so that's limits to how much you can have, they are the ones who have to ration it. So they're the ones who are doing that triage, right? How can I make this last, right? And the third reason this is particularly gendered is because if water is stored at home, it's subject to recontamination. So it gets contaminated, and then it's, dirtier than it was 2 days ago. Then the children are falling sick, and the women and the older girls in the family become the caregivers. So it's really multi-pronged, the sort of assault on women's quality of life that water shortages lead to.
And we all know, of course, that this is likely to get worse and worse. Climate change, of course, all sorts of other issues are coming more and more to the fore. I mean, how bad could it get?
This depends on what we do. There is nothing innately bad. Well, there is, but there is no reason for us to suspect that with climate change, it is inevitable that the water shortages will get worse and worse, right? This depends on how we act, right? We are making the future. We don't have to be in the business of predicting it, right? We can make it, right? So if we have political will and the financing needed to provide water, if not, 24/7 in the tap, if that's too much, then close enough to the compound or the home, then I think we can battle the most severe consequences. That being said, there will be severe consequences. Well-level water will fall, groundwater will get more mined because of agricultural needs. That's going to bring down the level of drinking water wells for people. So there will be exacerbated tragedies and suffering, but it doesn't have to be as bad as it looks like it might be, because our projections are based on the assumption that we're not going to do anything to change the situation. But I don't see why that should be the case.
And there are things that individuals can do as well?
Like rich individuals or poor individuals?
Both.
I mean, yes. But at the end of the day, that is not the way to get universal water for all. That has never been the way. I mean, yes, I can buy a bottle of water and they're going to put 5 cents into some place in Africa, which doesn't have water. Okay, fine, right? But how can you actually reach scale by millions of people buying millions of bottles of water? I mean, this seems like an absurd situation to me. It's a Band-Aid. It's a Band-Aid. You've got a hemorrhage going on and you've got a Band-Aid, right? And poor people, yes, they can treat their water with chlorine. They can boil it if it isn't a biomass stove. They can get water filters, but all of these are small expenditures that add up when you are a really low-resourced family.
And of course, when we think about water shortages and extreme heat, we think of those traditional places like Asia, like Australia, like African countries, like parts of the US.
Yeah.
But even a lot of other places. I mean, I'm thinking here in France, there's a severe water shortage in the southwest of France, Spain, around Barcelona at the moment. It's starting to encroach more and more on other areas as well, isn't it?
It is. But I want to make one thing clear. Personally, I don't like the use of the term water shortage. Water shortages don't arise because of lack of physical water resources. There's no country in the world that doesn't have enough internal renewable water resources, or very few countries in the world that don't have enough internal renewable water resources to provide their population with enough for domestic purposes. Water shortages arise when water that is available is used really unwisely or unproductively, or overused for purposes that then deprive others from meeting their basic needs. So water shortages are really should be reclassified as unwise water use rather than shortages, which make us think that somehow the physical commodity is lacking. This is usually not the case.
Good to talk to you on the programme today. Thanks very much for coming in, Isha Ray, Professor of the Energy and Resources Group at the University of California.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks very much.